Ever feel like you're hitting a ceiling with your learning? Like, you know you're capable of more, but haven't quite cracked the code.
Yeah.
Well, today,
Mm-hmm.
we're diving into innovations in educational psychology to do just that. Get ready to unlock some serious learning superpowers.
And the exciting thing is we often approach learning as this big, mysterious thing.
Right.
But when we break it down, there are so many practical insights that can make a huge difference.
Okay, so let's jump right into one of the fundamentals.
Hmm.
Reading.
Okay.
We kind of take it for granted,
Mm-hmm.
but the book points out that it's not as simple as it seems.
Right, and it actually highlights something crucial about how our brains are wired for language.
Okay.
While almost everyone learns to read eventually, how easily we get there varies a lot. One study mentioned in the book really highlights the role of phonological awareness.
So in a row, what now? Okay, gotta admit, that sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah.
Break that down for us.
It's simpler than it sounds. It's basically our ability to hear and play with the sounds inside words.
Okay.
Like knowing cat and hat rhyme, or that fit and pit start differently, even though they're similar.
Ah, okay, like the building blocks of words.
Right.
So kids who don't quite get that might have a tougher time learning to read.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The research connects early phonological awareness to how well kids read later on.
Right.
What's really cool is that focusing on these skills early on can make a huge difference for young readers.
It really makes you appreciate how much kids' brains are figuring out all the time. Speaking of which, the book dives into how even little ones, like 5- or 6-year-olds, start grasping complex math concepts, like proportions even before formal schooling.
Absolutely. They call it informal knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Think about a time you figured something out through everyday experience, like adjusting a recipe.
Right.
Your brain was already doing the math, even if you didn't realize it. Kids are doing the same thing, maybe noticing that doubling ingredients means twice the cookies.
That totally resonates.
Yeah.
I learned fractions by helping my grandma bake.
There you go.
So how do we bridge that to, like, textbook equations?
That's where teachers come in.
Okay.
The book argues that instead of treating it like a blank slate, education can be way more effective by building on this existing informal knowledge.
Right.
They use an example of researchers working with fishermen. Okay, fishermen and math.
Yeah.
This is intriguing.
Right.
Yeah.
These were fishermen who were already masters of proportions in their work, figuring out how much unshelled shrimp they needed for a specific weight of shelled shrimp for customers.
Right.
They were doing complex calculations daily without necessarily realizing it.
So the researchers helped them connect their real-world skills to the formal math.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about teaching math. It was about recognizing and validating the fishermen's existing knowledge.
Right.
And apparently, this approach can be especially helpful for learners who don't always thrive in traditional classrooms.
That's such a cool example.
It's like saying, hey, you're already doing this. Let's just give it a name and some structure.
I love that. It reminds us that learning isn't just about cramming new information. It's about making connections to what we already know.
Right.
And that leads perfectly into the book's emphasis on the power of why.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just memorize facts. We need to understand the why behind them.
Right.
And that's where self-explanation comes in. The book highlights research showing that when you explain something to yourself, even if it's just in your head, you learn and remember it much better.
So it's like you're teaching yourself, making those connections more concrete. Does the book give any specific examples of how that works in practice?
They do. One study focused on mathematical equality, and the results were fascinating.
Students who explained why both correct A and D incorrect answers were correct learned much more effectively.
Wow.
They weren't just identifying the right answer, they were understanding the underlying logic and avoiding common pitfalls.
Wow, that's a great takeaway for anyone studying anything, really.
Right.
Understanding the why behind both the right and the wrong answers. I'm definitely going to try that. Now, speaking of different ways of thinking, the book delves into something called the WICS model.
Okay.
What's that all about?
This is where things get really interesting. The WICS model challenges the traditional view of intelligence, the one that's solely based on things like grades and test scores.
Go ahead.
It stands for wisdom, intelligence, and creativity. Synthesize.
So more than just book smarts.
Exactly. The WICS model emphasizes that there are different types of intelligence, and they're all valuable for success both in and outside of school.
Okay.
To illustrate this, the book introduces us to 3 students, Alice, Barbara, and Celia.
Okay, let's meet these students. What are they like?
Alice is your classic high achiever,
Mm-hmm.
straight A's, top of the class,
Mm-hmm.
but she struggles with thinking outside the box.
Okay.
Then you have Barbara bursting with creativity and innovative ideas, but maybe not as strong when it comes to analytical skills.
Right.
And finally, there's Celia, the ultimate problem solver,
Okay.
able to take an idea and make it happen, even if she's not the most academically inclined.
So it's like they each have a superpower, but no one has all of them at once.
Exactly. And that's the core message of the WICS model. True success comes from a balance of wisdom, intelligence, and creativity all working together.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So how do we nurture that balance? Because let's be honest, traditional education systems often seem to favor the Alices of the world.
You're right. And the book suggests we need to create learning environments that value all three aspects of WICS.
Mm-hmm.
For example, to boost creativity, we could encourage students to think like investors, seeking out those undervalued ideas and having the courage to go against the grain.
Instead of just memorizing the textbook, we should be rewarding them for independent thinking and new perspectives.
Precisely. Celebrate those aha moments, even if they're a little unconventional. And when it comes to practical intelligence, we need to bridge the gap between knowledge and action. It's not enough to know stuff. We need to be able to use it in the real world.
It's like having all the ingredients for a delicious cake, but not knowing how to bake it.
Yeah.
Practical intelligence is what helps you turn knowledge into something real. But what about wisdom?
Right.
That seems harder to teach from a textbook.
You're right. Wisdom is more about character and judgment.
Right.
The book highlights some key elements of wisdom,
Okay.
including things like considering the greater good, seeking out diverse perspectives, and finding a balance between our own needs and the needs of others.
So it's about making well-rounded decisions that benefit not just ourselves, but also the people around us.
Exactly. And the book even points out that even the most intelligent people can make unwise choices when they lack that broader perspective.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Just because you have a high IQ doesn't mean you always make smart choices, right?
You know, precisely. The WICS model is about developing not just knowledgeable students, but wise and ethical individuals who can navigate the complexities of life.
So it's about more than just acing a test. It's about developing that wisdom to navigate real-life situations.
Right.
But how do we actually apply all this WICS thinking? Like, what can our listeners who are ready to level up their learning game actually do with these insights?
That's a great question. And I think the book would say it starts with looking in the mirror.
Right.
We need to figure out where our own strengths and weaknesses lie within each of those WICS areas: wisdom, intelligence, and creativity.
Okay.
Then we can get intentional about growth.
It's like giving ourselves a mental skills assessment. Are we rocking it in one area but neglecting another? Do we even know what kind of learner we are?
Exactly. Maybe you realize you're a total Alice, great at analysis, but need to loosen up that creative side a little.
Right.
In that case, the book would suggest seeking out opportunities to flex those muscles.
Okay.
Maybe an improv class or picking up a new creative hobby.
And if you're more of a Barbara, overflowing with ideas but struggling to make them concrete, maybe focus on strengthening those analytical skills.
Right. Maybe a logic course,
Okay.
or even just practicing critical thinking exercises could be game changers. And let's not forget Celia and that practical intelligence. It's all about bridging that gap between what we know and what we can do.
Totally. Finding ways to apply what we're learning in real-world scenarios.
Right.
Starting a side project, volunteering for a cause we're passionate about. Those are all ways to turn knowledge into action. Now, one thing that really stood out to me in the book was the emphasis on seeking diverse perspectives. It wasn't just about what we learn, but who we learn from.
Yes. And they highlighted a fascinating study that really brought this home.
Okay.
Researchers facilitated discussions between American college students and their professor, who was originally from China.
Okay.
The students who learned about Chinese culture firsthand, hearing personal stories about things like the Cultural Revolution, developed a much deeper understanding of their professor.
It's like, it's one thing to read about another culture in a textbook,
Right.
but it's a whole different ballgame to connect with someone's lived experiences.
Yeah.
It adds a whole new layer of understanding.
Exactly. And the book argues that this kind of cross-cultural understanding is crucial for developing wisdom. It's about recognizing that there are multiple ways of looking at the world,
Right.
and we can learn and grow from those differences.
It's like expanding our horizons and realizing that our way of seeing things isn't the only way. or even necessarily the right way.
Precisely. And I think that's a powerful takeaway from this deep dive into learning and cognition. It's not just about stuffing our brains with information, but about becoming more open-minded, more understanding, and ultimately wiser human beings.
I love that. So much to think about. We've covered a ton of ground today, from the nitty-gritty of how our brains learn to read to this bigger picture idea of developing wisdom through diverse perspectives. What a journey. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this deep dive?
Just that I hope our listeners feel inspired to keep those why questions coming, to embrace those aha moments, and to never stop exploring the incredible world of knowledge and understanding. It's a lifelong journey and one that's full of amazing discoveries.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into innovations in educational psychology. We'll catch you next time for another adventure in learning.